seat there. Grab a seat. Grab a seat.
This one.
How's Michael?
Oh, he's great.
Yeah?
He's great. I'm doing all the work, so it's great.
Sure, why would he be? Why wouldn't he be? So, from Chief People Officer to Chief Executive Officer, tell us about what you did differently from the day you joined Ryanair, and maybe just give us 3 examples of some of the significant things that you did that got you to the position to be considered for CEO.
Yeah, I mean, to make that jump, it's not a template that is particularly transferable. So I don't claim to say that this is the way that you make that transition. A lot of it's to do with yourself. It's to do with the organization, the culture, and all that. But in Ryanair, I remember when I started there 25 years ago as head of HR, nobody told me that the baggage handlers were going to be on strike by 11 o'clock on the first day that I got there. I was wondering why everybody was sniggering when I got in the door, and they told me that the previous 10 HR people that were in there had a life expectancy of about 9 months. So I didn't even know where the toilet was, before I knew that we were on strike. And then we precipitated the closure at Dublin Airport, a national transport strike, and all that. So it was, but the good news for me was, and there was an opportunity there. I didn't come in at a level that put me into I was reporting into the Chief Operations Officer, but from day one, because of that, and took the opportunity, I joined that table, even though I wasn't officially at that table, and I just used that opportunity then. And when I was at that table, I moved into things like, Ryanair didn't fly to Spain at that stage. And then we found just by traveling to Spain, and I got time to understand why we couldn't do that, and I came up with a novel solution. So then got into ground handling, doing airport deals while you were still doing HR. Then ultimately I got responsibility for the retail program. I don't know anything about retail, but we were running a 200 million euro business at the time with 2 people on 3 rules, which we still do today, which is the margin has to be X, and you have to, the margin has to be X. You have to give us a pile of money to put something on the trolley because you've got to take something else out, and if we don't sell it, you've got to take it back. Now, that is a sort of a microcosm of everything that happens in Ryanair. We spend most of our time deciding what we're not going to do, okay? Because you never have enough people to deal with things. Keep it simple. And at that time, when I was running the retail program, there were lots of products that came in and people would say, try this, try this, try this. But that would have meant I would have had to hire more and more and more and more people. Kept it simple, kept the margin, kept the product moving. We made lots of mistakes, but we kept it simple, and we still run that business like that today. And that's going to be the key, I suppose, coming from HR into this growth phase for Ryanair again. Largest airline in Europe by some distance. We're the #1 airline in Spain, Italy, Ireland, UK, and how we're going to continue to grow that business, and how you keep that organization tight with the secret sauce, which a lot of it would have been, the sort of imprimatur of Michael on that, So in terms of how it grew, but now it's a multinational company, and how we sort of still keep it local.
Interesting. You remind me of what Lars said. So going into it like a retail function coming out of HR, of your own initiative, agile learning, using the network to learn things you didn't know. So this was a model that Lara spoke about this morning around what's next for HR. It strikes me, and I don't know about all of you in the room, but I would have thought that Ryanair had a tough culture. I always thought I had a really tough environment. How did you see that change over the course of your evolution from HR into different facets of the business?
It's not tough in the way that people tend to equate tough with unforgiving,
Okay.
But it's not that way. I mean, if you like it in Ryanair, you absolutely love it, right? If you don't like it, it's awful, right? It's absolutely awful.
Daryl was telling me that earlier on.
Yeah.
Where is he?
Yeah. But, and the reason is because it's formulaic, and we hit upon a formula that works, and most of the time is trying to keep that between the ditches, as we say here in Ireland, and we have the advantage of it being a regulated industry as well. So you don't have to reinvent it every day. Like 90% plus of the people who come to work in Ireland, come to work in Ryanair, are pilots, cabin crew, and engineers. And they have a way of doing things. If I paid them and I had fuel on the aircraft, the management could go away for 6 months and come back, and it would pretty much run itself anyway until you had to do so regulation. You know, sometimes people say, well, how come if you've got regulation, and how do you eke out competitive advantage, which we've been able to do? We have significantly lower costs than anyone else. How do you do that? You have one airplane, 2 pilots, 4 cabin crew, engineers, everything's got to be done exactly the same. And we can eke out competitive advantage, real competitive advantage. That's why we've got the lowest fares.
And you also revolutionised the whole industry
as
a result of that.
But it's about, you can do it. I would love to have a go at running, I don't know, BMW or something like that. See if we could knock out BMWs, you know, like for 10 grand instead of 40 grand, you know?
I think they'd love it to run BMW as well.
I don't know what they'd look like, or, you know, like, they'd probably be the same. They'd all be black, you know, like, they'd all have that.
I'd say a little trumpet as a horn. Could you imagine?
But you'd have that. But think about it. We eke out competitive advantage. There's about 5 coastlines in our business. Oil is the same price, except we hedge it, and we've got the financial strength to do that. We've got aircraft. You know, it's not like, say, when Michael was doing the deals with Boeing, that we sat down there and played poker, and we were able to play, you know, to play the best hand. It's a cyclical business, and it's about picking the right time to buy those aircraft. And in some cases, we had to wait 6 years. But you always have to have a fallback plan. Fallback plan was, we didn't fly the aircraft in the winter, so we got extra capacity. So just when the airports realized, or Boeing realized, they've told their shareholders they're going to have more capacity next year, and they haven't bought any airplanes off us, how are they going to do that? We would release the capacity that we'd kept up. You always have to have something in your back pocket. You've got to think. We think strategically on having those coastlines, airplanes, people, airport, oil, and other ancillary costs. That gives us the ability then to do things on a weekly basis. So I was talking to some of my previous colleagues here. Antoinette, who was up here earlier, and I think she has brought it in. We have a weekly list system. Everybody writes a report, you know, and she says, you're not still doing those reports because she's doing it in her company, God love her. But what happens is everybody's got a list. And if you were to talk to the academics, they would tell you that's the wrong thing to do, because you're not looking at the bigger things. We've already looked at the bigger things, and now we get involved in the minutiae, and that's the type of thing where people don't like the culture of Ryanair, is that at least we all go to a meeting first thing 8:30 Monday morning. Then those people disperse into, that meeting finishes at 10 o'clock. They then go do their meetings. Then by 12 o'clock, everybody knows what they're doing in that building, even if it's the wrong thing, right? So they're all doing it. So you'll hear people walking around the building saying, well, it's a Z action item. Like even the chef at the canteen, I think, sometimes says it's a Z action item, you know, like, but that means it must be done. Yeah. Now, that might sound like it's oppressive or not, but it's a tremendous clarity in getting things done. When you finish the end of the week, you've done those things, right? They're all done. They just happen. And, you know, here's the thing as well. Most of your competitors are lazy bastards, right? Okay? Like, they really are. And that's something that Michael would have imposed on the business, because he's a shareholder and he's there every day from 7:30 in the morning, so that you have that focus all the time. Again, not in an oppressive way, but in a way that it must be done. If you like that, you get that feedback all day long, because you've achieved things. If you don't like it, you know, and that doesn't mean that you don't look at things that are more strategic. But in Ryanair generally, on the management side, you have to earn your stripes on delivering day to day before anyone will listen to you on anything else.
You said academics a moment ago. Harvard knocked on your door. They came in to do a business case on your culture. What did they find?
Yeah, we had this old building, and it was euphemistically called the White House. It was anything but the White House at the time in Dublin Airport, and we crammed everything into that small building. And we used to bring airports along and leave them sitting in the lobby for 6 hours to soften them up before we did the deal with them and all sorts of things like that, and all sorts of tricks. And everybody worked on pretty much 2 floors. There was operations downstairs where all the pilots and cabin crew reported to. So you have this sort of and then you had on the next floor, you had commercial, HR, engineering records, and then finance on the second floor. So everybody was in that building. So it was always an eye-opener for people to come. And the Harvard Business Review, I think this was back in 2000, came along because they looked at companies that had above average returns and they wanted to see what was happening. So we brought them along. They came in to see us. And, they asked me about what was the mission of the company. I said, well, we don't really have one of those, like I think it's to make money, And so then they said, well, what training do you do? And I said, well, we train pilots and cabin crew and engineers, but what about the management team? We don't do any of that, because the culture of the company at that time in relation to training, and it may sound archaic to you, but if you've got a culture that says you take a person, you put them through a training course, and then they can fly a $100 million aircraft, then you associate training with output. So you don't tend to associate training with doing courses to make people feel better or whatever it is, okay? Even though we still struggled with people putting the answers in on Excel spreadsheets without putting the formulas in and that. So maybe we should have done some extra training. But anyway, Harvard Business Review came in and they said, well, what is the vision? Couldn't tell them. What are the values of the company? I said, why don't you just go and ask somebody? So we walked around and, somebody on reception, what's the mission? What's the mission of this company? And variously the answers were don't spend money. Somebody else said 737s only. Other people, there was all these disparate groups. But actually, if you pulled them all together, they were the bits that they heard, and they intuitively knew what we were about. But there was no course. There was no PowerPoint, there was none of that at all. But if you were in that building, you knew what was going on, or if you had the interest, you would know what was going on. So I think that was instructive, I think, at the time, that you don't have a tick box of, and again, I would come back to it like culturally, and again, coming from Ireland, some of the stuff that we've lost, where you've got this, you have an airline like that went on to dominate what's going on in Europe. And doing it by the seat of the pants, and I don't mean that from a safety perspective, because it was a separate organization. That was one of the biggest conundrums that we got out of this, that we had a safety organization that did it exactly like every other airline, but fine-tuned it, and then you had this sort of anarchic management structure that didn't dip into that. But we did react to anyone who was trying to put anything on top of that would make us more or would make us less efficient. So it was like being in a rock band or something, like wandering around Europe. It was just great fun, Still is.
Someone use a rock star analogy.
No, rock band. I'm not the rock star.
I was talking about Michael.
Exactly.
I'm joking. No, but someone mentioned the fellowship that comes with rock and roll, or like an iconic rock star, you know what I mean? And trying to create that sense of belonging. So you're across 90 countries or so. So how do you bind your people? How do you communicate?
Everybody goes on about working from home. We've been doing it for years. Pilots and cabin crew are away from the office. So it's the equivalent of working from home. So we got through all those challenges from a long, long time back, and how we communicate with people and what we have to do, because it's not just about communicating with them to tell them about the culture. You have to have communication channels that tell them what has changed about the operation of the aircraft or whatever it is. And you've got to get that out to 90 different locations.
How do you do that?
Well, nobody's ever done that before. Anyone who's here from the States will say that, if you take, Aer Lingus have one base in Dublin, Lufthansa have 2 bases essentially in Munich and Frankfurt, and Ryanair is 90. So trying to maintain standards, we were the very first ones that put in the equivalent of Formula One telemetry in the back of aircraft, almost well over 20 years ago. But most other companies wouldn't allow that, because you'd have the data on the people. It was the equivalent of watching what they do. Okay. Now, I don't know which airline you'd prefer to be with. I'd prefer to be with the one that had the data that we knew about, that if somebody wasn't flying the aircraft as the way they should do, we knew about that, and that allowed us to, because in airlines you've got to standardize everything. And once and anyone who's got who doesn't run an airline but's got branch offices, you'll know how difficult it is to have standardization. So that goes to a completely different level with an airline. So even though we wouldn't have been known about for our technology, we were doing that, I suppose, behind the scenes. And that, that's another area I would have got involved in as well, like on Ryanair.com. We did that like right at the start.
Yeah.
Nobody in Ryanair knew anything about IT because we didn't have an IT department.
And was Eddie's Twitter before Twitter?
No, it wasn't. No. I called it Eddie's Twitter at the time because I'm not on social media, but I knew I needed something like that. And then eventually it was Work Vivo. It's almost like everyone who comes up here mentions Work Vivo. I think they must be paying for holidays for everyone or doing something. But again, and that has been really helpful for us because we already have a community. We developed one ourselves called Fleet Tweet. And then they came along with a much more finessed version of that allowed pictures and two-way communication, which we previously didn't have on Fleet Tweet.
So milestone moments that got you to where you are. So I think of one, and just looking from the outside in, so you weren't unionized. So one of the only airlines in the world, perhaps, who weren't, and now you are.
Yeah.
What role did you have in that?
I had my role was to keep the unions out for a long time, and one of the reasons was that we were small, and if we were going to be caught up in everything in all those different countries, we'd have never got the momentum, right? So we would have started from we would have had things like, say, Irish contracts of employment in all those countries because. I made the argument at the time for many years that they weren't actually working in Italy, they were working in Ireland because they were on Irish registered aircraft, and it was the Chicago Convention and all sorts of things, whatever in it. But anyway, that allowed us to have a one type approach and control it from Dublin. And I knew it was eventually going to change. But it's like everything, it's like St. Augustine, I'm going to give it up tomorrow, and it was eventually going to come. And when we had the rostering crisis back in 2017, it came like a tsunami, I remember when I called out a section of one of our contracts of employment that they'd be null and void, et cetera, that our lawyer from Italy called me on a Saturday morning. He's a rugby fan. He says, "Eddie, you are more famous than Brian O'Driscoll in Italy. You've united the left, the right, the centre in Italy. They all hate you."
I was wondering where that was going.
But then we had a team that had to go and negotiate union deals over the last 5 years. And a group of people to go to war with, you would never, truly unique HR people. I'm not just saying it because some of them are here, but the idea that we had to talk to all the major unions who wanted us on toast and do that, and to come out the other end of that with a model still in place, because don't forget what happened in that time for negotiation was the outside unions who ran Alitalia or ran Lufthansa or ran Air France saw an opportunity to drag us down in terms of our efficiencies. Then eventually we had to get through that because who doesn't want more money and more time off? I do too, so your employees are going to want that as well. But then the penny slowly dropped with our own people that, well, if we go to that model, then we're not going to have jobs. And that took a long, long time. So we would have emerged from that process with what I would call the operations Bible, with how we do 25-minute turnarounds, how we do the optimization of aircraft, the number of crews per aircraft, how we promote people, the payment systems that got a balance of fixed and variable pay, and all those things that go into the model. And at the end of that, that was intact. And then we had to convince every individual country to do that. And it took a long, long time to do. And that's why we had to go through the pain of strikes, because if we compromised, we'd have a completely different airline today. It is, when I go to places in Italy now, we have transformed travel. People tend to think of travel as being discretionary in the whole climate debate. It's not discretionary. It transforms countries. I would argue that a lot of the FDI in Ireland wouldn't have come if it wasn't for Ryanair. The AWSs, Google, Meta and all those, they depend largely on a lot of people coming into Ireland to work here. And it's great that they can get home at the weekend for 19 euros or 49 euros or 99 euros, whatever it's coming. So they can get on things like that. So we add that free infrastructure. And we've done it in places like Italy, where people fly from, previously couldn't have jobs in Rome, fly from Sicily every day on a Ryanair flight and fly home in the evening time. Now, people might see that as a luxury, but it's not a luxury if you're living in Palermo and there's no jobs there, and you can now work in Rome. So, you know, airline travel and what we've done in terms of communities, like we're carried shoulder high through the streets in some places, because once we arrive in town, it is like Walmart or something arriving. It means that there's going to be connectivity, there's going to be lower fares. It's not just about holidays, it'll be about people going on business, people visiting friends and relatives, education, the Erasmus program, all these things. So I'm really proud of it. I mean, like, even things like the Ukraine war. I mean, who would have thought that, and we have very close contacts with the Ukrainian embassy here, but like most of people of my age, my memories of black and white photographs of refugees in Europe are people going in handcarts, you know, like bringing every last piece of possessions that they have. And here you had people going through a border into a friendly country like Poland, and then accessing Ryanair flights alongside people going for business for the day or going on holidays or to visiting friends and relatives. And the fact that you're able to sort of do that, like, I think is remarkable. Or when the Berlin Wall went down, the fact that people, the biggest movement of people, when Ireland and the UK and I think Austria opened for people to come and work here who could get full rights to come from Central and Eastern Europe, were able to move largely with airlines like Ryanair and build family support structures and all. Like it is remarkable when you see that on the ground. And you don't see it from Ireland here, because people tend to think of it as being, you know, still, some people tend to think of it still as, oh, that's Ryanair, yeah, they bring it down to Malaga and it's holidays, and isn't it terrible, people trashing the climate and all that.
My observation in spending time with you, Eddie, is he a marketeer, a salesperson, an operator, a HR person? Like, there's a whole business impact even in the messages, the words you say. But from our last conversation, you mentioned the word customer more than you mentioned any other word, which struck me. And I think in many ways, the last couple of years around this tug of war has been employer, employee. And we spoke about ESG. We haven't spoken enough about kind of societal impact, perhaps. We haven't spoken about shareholder value, perhaps, was part of the conversation this morning, and it's starting to surface as one of the reasons why layoffs are happening in tech, all that type of stuff. But customer, it's clearly central to most things you do.
Yeah.
How did you think about that in the CPO seat? And what impact did that have on you becoming CEO?
Well, I don't think there was anything in particular with me in terms of the customer, but I mean, it is, because it was such a flat organization, you're always just, you know, at most 2 levels away from the customer, whether it was, you know, the cabin crew or probably the group that interact most with customers. For good and for bad, and also with, not so much with the ground people, because in a lot of places that's, in Dublin there are our own people, and in Stansted there are our own people, but in a lot of places they're not, they're third parties. And that's going to be some of the biggest challenges for us as well, because what we're doing at the moment is, and again, like, I want to be customer focused. Like, people say, what did you do during the pandemic? We never left the office. I looked at refunds at that time, which was money going out the door, as to how we could make this easier for when we got back to the office. Now, if you have a refund with Ryanair, if we cancel your flight or change it and you don't want to, you get an email, you click a button, it's in your wallet within 24 hours, and if you want to cash out, it's all automatic. So it's gradually getting to all those edge cases to do things, you know, like I always hold up Amazon as somebody or a company that we want to sort of emulate that. Geez, if they can do that with all those suppliers, and we've got this really simple product with really simple rules, that we can deal with the edge cases and the customer. Like, I still get a lot of customer complaints that come into me directly in terms of escalations. It is something that you want to do. You're not going to get any, like, the biggest thing you can do with customers is, and we saw this in the pandemic, after the pandemic, when airports and airlines didn't return, the mystique has all gone out of it. Nobody wants to go to an airport. And if the truth be told, nobody wants to get on an airplane. Everybody wants to get off the other end, right? So they want to get on as cheaply as possible. Once the aircraft is safe, it looks new, it's all about how we dealt with things like supermarkets over the last 20 and 30 years. Suddenly they were the places that you had to root through all the boxes. Now they've got, we always say, oh, what about the cheesemaker? The local baker will be out of business. All nonsense. If you don't want the local baker to go out of business, buy his bread at twice the price you get somewhere else. But, go into the supermarkets. Now all those supermarkets have got, great delicatessens, great bakeries and all that. Like, it all comes around, and air travel is exactly the same. Now you find that we were the edge case. We were the Aldi, we were the Lidl. Now if you want to fly, I remember when we started, Aer Lingus would have flown from Dublin to Barcelona twice a day when we were opening up Spain. Now we're doing it 3 times a day, and they may be doing it once a day or less than that. So now we've got the volume. So we've got the pricing, we've got the new aircraft, we've got the safety, as all airlines have to have, and now we've got the frequency. Now you're a behemoth in terms of how you're going to change. So once people get something at a low price, they're never, ever, ever going back. If you can get a pint for €1, you're never going to pay a pint for €5 or €6 again. You're going to take that, and then you're going to put the pressure on those to survive.
And in many ways, that's what we spoke about around the transformation. Have we gone through a one-way door around the world of work, and certain things will not go back? Will not go back, is what Darren mentioned earlier on. My last question: coming from the CPO seat, from our world, to replace big shoes in Michael O'Leary, what in particular do you think has stood to you being in the CPO seat in replacing him, and what impact has that had in the business?
Well, Michael's still the group CEO, so even though, but I think, most of the difficulties we always have, and particularly in HR, are the 2% that goes wrong, and they're generally people-related stuff as well in organizations, whether they're suppliers, whether they're customers. Your negotiating skills, your persuasion skills, your ability to see ahead, not to react to things as a hothead, to work at how this is going to work out over the next month and next year, I think gives you that edge. If it isn't that complicated, because actually when you get to be CEO, you have all these clever people reporting to you as well,
Just get a better CPO than you were, is that it?
Yeah. Well, no, we got an excellent one on that. But no, you've got lots of clever people. So you're doing all the things that you would have done before, which is, all the standard stuff, like leading, coordinating, planning, all that. But you've got a good lineup, But I think the important things, though, for anyone in this room to do that is to get a general management feel for it. Think about customers, think about process, think about strategy. What are the 3 or 4 main levers in your company that makes it work? And then everything else will fall into place. Don't be a pain in the arse from the sort of HR point of view of going around telling people that you've got to do this and you've got to do it in a certain way. Nobody's interested, and they will, as soon as you, and in lots of companies now, they'll feign interest until you go out the door and then throw it over their shoulder and say, let's get on with that. And then you do no service to yourself or to HR. HR is about, if you can support the management of the business, you will be seen to be a general manager, because you'll know what they don't even know what they want in a year's time in terms of the type of talent that you want, the types of processes, understand technology, get a rounded view. And that, I think, I sort of hit the jackpot with going into Ryanair and having that opportunity day one. But people like, say, Michael, just doesn't care where you came from once you can do the work.
Interesting. We're looking this way, Eddie, for new titles, new areas, and into new spaces that we can influence. I think what you're saying is to ground it into something general that's not so sexy, but drives the business forward.
Like the way I would graphically say it, and I said it on the podcast in there, which was that if that's the width of things that you do, or HR, that you read through all the books, do that amount well for the company that you're in. Like, we really were ahead of the game on staff communications. There's some people that say, when I was looking at that from the outside, it didn't look like it. It was, because 80-90% of the people knew what the business model was, and you had to constantly communicate that. So we did that really, really well. And that's why we were able to sustain it for so long. But I think sometimes there's this element of, and I hope there's nobody from Procter & Gamble here, but like, oh, let's do this. Procter & Gamble are doing it. These are doing it. We have to do it. And here's a great idea. Nobody is interested. They're not.
Eddie, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us.
Thanks a lot.
You can listen to them all day.